Hey there, I'm Ali. Ready to escape into a story and drift into deep sleep? Let's begin. Lila walked softly along the narrow path that wound through the darkened forest, the cool night air thick with mist. The fog seemed to swirl in from nowhere, enveloping her in a strange, almost otherworldly quiet. Above her, the moon was a soft glow behind layers of fog, casting just enough light to guide her steps. She didn't know why she'd come this way tonight. There was no reason to take the old path through the forest, and yet an odd feeling had tugged at her, pulling her feet forward with each step. It was as if some unseen force had taken hold, guiding her, almost urging her through the trees. After a while, the forest began to thin, and through the mist, Lila saw something. A cluster of houses, silent and still under the moonlight. The village looked ancient, as though time had forgotten it. Ivy climbed over stone walls, windows sat empty and dark, and the doors creaked faintly, as if moved by a breeze only they could feel. As she took a hesitant step forward, she felt it again. That strange, inexplicable feeling that she was not alone. She looked around, but there was no one there. Just the fog curling around her feet, and the silence that seemed almost alive. Lila, a voice murmured, soft and breathy. She froze, her heart quickening. The voice was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was so soft that she almost thought she'd imagined it. But as she stood there, her breath shallow, she heard it again, a little louder this time. Lila. The sound sent a chill down her spine, yet it was oddly gentle, as if calling her name wasn't a warning, but an invitation. Lila swallowed, glancing around the village. The air was thick with mystery, an invitation she couldn't resist. Slowly she walked forward, each step echoing in the silence. She noticed the way the fog seemed to part for her, like it was leading her somewhere. "Hello," she whispered into the mist. There was no answer, only the whisper of her own voice bouncing back to her. But she felt it, a presence, something just beyond her sight. The silence was heavy, expectant, as though the village itself was waiting, watching. She made her way past the crumbling houses, her eyes drawn to the little details. Carved wooden doorways, faded signs that once had words she could no longer read, empty windows that stared like dark eyes. The village was abandoned, yet it felt like it was only sleeping, as though its inhabitants had just slipped away, leaving it frozen in time. And then she saw it. A small house at the end of the street, its windows dark but somehow inviting. She felt an odd pull toward it, as if something or someone was calling her. Taking a deep breath, she approached the house. Her footsteps were soft on the overgrown grass, each step making her heart beat a little faster. When she reached the door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, and the door creaked, echoing into the empty night. Inside, the house was quiet and still. Shadows clung to the corners, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood and age. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of worn furniture, a chair by the window, a table covered in dust, and a fireplace with cold ashes. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled on the old wooden floor. As she explored the house, she felt the presence again, stronger this time. It was as though someone was standing just behind her, watching her every move. But when she turned around, there was no one there. "Lila," the voice whispered again, closer this time, as if someone were standing right beside her. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was still no one there. Just the empty room, the shadows, and the strange, silent village beyond the door. but she could feel it. A warmth, a presence that felt almost familiar, as if it knew her thoughts, her secrets. Who? Who's there? She called out softly. The only response was silence, deep and profound. But within that silence she felt a strange comfort. It was as if the house was listening, waiting for her to say something more. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of old wood and memories. And then she saw it, a glimmer of light, faint but steady, coming from a room at the back of the house. She followed it, her footsteps slow and careful, the old floor creaking beneath her. The light was soft, almost like a candle's glow, casting long shadows on the walls. When she reached the room, she found it empty, and on a small table near the window sat a dusty book, its cover worn and faded. She picked it up, brushing away the dust. The book fell open to a page in the middle, as though it had been waiting for her all this time. The words on the page were handwritten, elegant yet faded with time. As she read them, her heart skipped a beat. To the one who finds this, know that you are not alone. We are watching, always watching, waiting for you to remember. She frowned, reading the words again. They felt strange, as if they were meant for her, as though the village had been waiting for her to come, waiting for her to find this place, this book, these words. Lila closed the book, her mind swirling with questions. Who were they? And what were they waiting for? She wanted to leave, to run from the strange village in the eerie house, but something held her there. She felt as though the answers were close, just out of reach, waiting for her to find them. The voice called her name again, a whisper in the silence, soft and gentle. She felt a chill run through her, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, a strange mix of curiosity and familiarity, as if a part of her had been here before, had known this place, this voice. Slowly, she walked back toward the door, stepping out into the night once more. The village was still, silent, the fog thick and heavy around her. But she felt the presence with her, a quiet companionship, as if the village itself was walking beside her, guiding her. As she made her way down the empty streets, she felt a strange peace settling over her. The questions still lingered, swirling in her mind, but she no longer felt alone. She felt as though the village had given her something, a gift of sorts, though she couldn't quite understand what it was. When she reached the edge of the village, she turned back, looking at the empty houses, the silent streets, the mist curling around them like a shroud. She felt a pang of sadness, a longing she couldn't explain, as if she were leaving behind a part of herself, something she had forgotten but now remembered, even if only faintly. "Goodbye," she whispered, her voice soft in the stillness. As she turned to leave, she heard the whisper once more, a gentle fading echo that drifted on the wind. "Until next time, Lila." The word sent a shiver through her, a quiet promise, a reminder that the village would be there, waiting for her, whenever she was ready to return. She walked away, the night closing in around her, but she felt a strange warmth within her, a secret she would carry with her, a mystery only she could understand. The fog parted as she walked, the path opening before her, leading her back to the world she had come from. But she knew in the depths of her heart that the village was still there, waiting in the mist, holding its secrets, its whispers, and perhaps one day she would return to uncover them all. For now she walked, her footsteps soft in the night, her heart calm, her mind drifting, lulled by the gentle silence, the lingering memory of the village,
and the soft whisper of her name in the mist, and as she walked, she felt the peace of the night settle over her, carrying her gently into sleep, with the quiet promise of another journey, another mystery, waiting in the shadows of her dreams. Lila had always been curious about her roots. Growing up, she had been enchanted by her grandmother's stories, tales of a small forgotten village nestled in misty hills where her ancestors had lived. The stories were warm and vibrant, each word weaving a connection to a time long past. But her grandmother had passed away, leaving a void filled with unanswered questions and fragmented memories. Lila decided it was time to visit the village, to walk those same paths her ancestors had once traveled. As she arrived, a delicate unease wrapped around her like a mist. The village was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it held its breath in anticipation. Houses stood with their windows like blank eyes, old and weathered yet full of a mysterious charm. Ancient stones lined the paths, and faded signs hinted at the village's forgotten tales.
Lila began walking, her feet treading on soft moss-covered stones, her ears attuned to the silence. She thought of her grandmother, whose voice always held a smile when she talked about this place. As she ventured deeper, an odd sensation crept over her, a sense of being watched. Her mind dismissed it as nerves. After all, she was a stranger here, and perhaps the villagers were naturally curious. But something felt strange. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, elusive and fleeting. She would turn her head, but nothing was there. Only silence greeted her, a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each step. Maybe it's the trees, she murmured to herself, her voice almost swallowed by the dense air. The forest surrounding the village was thick with tall, ancient trees that stretched toward the sky. Their branches swayed lightly in the breeze, casting dancing shadows on the ground. But there was a heaviness, an old energy, as if the forest itself held memories of her ancestors. As she continued walking, she thought about her grandmother's stories. "Our family comes from strong roots," her grandmother had said, her eyes shining with pride. "This village has seen many storms, yet it stands. We come from people who endure." Lila felt a warmth in her chest, a reminder of the strength passed down to her. The trail led her to a small, forgotten path, partially hidden under a carpet of leaves. She hesitated, sensing that this path had not been walked in a long time, yet something pulled her forward. Her heart beat a little faster, an echo of excitement mixed with unease. This was the road less traveled, a path that might hold answers. As she ventured further, she noticed the village seemed to fade into an older world. The air felt denser, quieter, as if she were crossing into a place untouched by time. Her footsteps became softer, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker. There it was again, that strange feeling of being watched. But this time it felt closer, as if someone or something was right behind her. She turned, her eyes scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling, a tingling on the back of her neck. The trees loomed, their branches forming intricate patterns against the sky. Shadows swayed and dipped. She couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else moving. The feeling was subtle yet persistent, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. "Maybe I'm just tired," she thought, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She reminded herself why she was here. Her grandmother's stories had always left her wanting more, but now that she was here, those memories felt almost alive. Lila could practically hear her grandmother's voice, soft and comforting, urging her to be brave and follow her curiosity. a strange way, the unease kept her alert, as if the village itself was guiding her. As she walked, she noticed small signs, an old well covered in moss, an ancient oak tree with initials carved into its bark. Each sight felt familiar, yet distant, like memories she had never lived. The path led her to a small clearing where a worn bench sat beneath a towering tree. She decided to rest, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath her. The air was thick with the scent of earth and old wood, grounding her amidst her rising curiosity. She closed her eyes, letting herself drift into a memory. She remembered sitting with her grandmother on their porch, the sky painted with the soft colors of dusk. "There are things we don't understand, my child," grandmother had said, her voice filled with quiet wisdom. "That doesn't mean they aren't real." Lila opened her eyes, feeling strange comfort in those words. The village had mysteries which she sensed wasn't threatening her. It was watching, waiting, as if testing her resolve. The shadows, the whispers, the sensation of being followed, they were all part of the village's silent invitation, urging her to look deeper. As she continued her journey, she noticed something peculiar. Each path seemed to lead her in circles, back to places she had already been. It was as if the village itself was guiding her, drawing her deeper into its secrets. She let herself follow, her curiosity growing stronger than her unease. She had come here for answers, and she was determined to find them. Night was approaching, and the village took on a softer glow. The shadows grew longer, yet somehow gentler, almost welcoming. She found herself in front of a small cottage, its windows dark but inviting. The door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for her to step inside. Taking a deep breath, she entered, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet. The cottage smelled of old wood and herbs, a familiar scent that reminded her of home. A small table stood in the center, with a faded photograph of a family. She felt a pang in her chest as she looked closer. The faces were blurry, but there was a resemblance, a feeling that this could be her family. A faint whisper echoed through the room, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She closed her eyes, listening, letting the sounds wash over her. The whispers weren't words, but emotions, a sense of love, loss, and a longing to be remembered. The cottage held memories, a silent tribute to those who'd come before her. As she stood there, she felt a warmth on her shoulder, as if someone had placed a gentle hand there. She turned, but no one was there, and yet the sensation lingered, a comforting presence that made her feel welcome. Lila knew she had found what she was looking for, even if it wasn't what she had expected. The village had shown her glimpses of her ancestors, not through words, but through feelings, whispers, and shadows. She understood now why her grandmother had loved this place, why she had spoken of it with such reverence. As she made her way back, the unease had lifted, replaced by a quiet peace. The shadows no longer felt threatening. They were simply part of the village, its silent guardians watching over her journey. She had found a connection, a thread that tied her to this place and its secrets. Lila walked through the village one last time, the mist settling around her like a gentle embrace. She no longer felt alone. She was surrounded by the presence of her ancestors, their memories etched into the stones and trees. With a final glance at the village, she whispered, "Thank you," knowing that her journey had only just begun. This place was a part of her, and she knew she would return, drawn by the quiet magic that had guided her tonight. As she left, the shadows faded, merging into the mist as if they too were satisfied. The village had shared its story, and Lila had found her place within it, her heart filled with the quiet peace of belonging. The village was veiled in shadows as evening settled in, casting a hushed, timeless stillness over everything. Lila's earlier journey had brought her a strange comfort, a sense of connection to her roots she hadn't felt before. But as she ventured deeper, her curiosity drew her towards an old, abandoned house at the edge of the village, where the trees clustered thickly and the air was dense with a quiet foreboding. The house stood alone, its walls weathered and cracked, shrouded in an aura of secrets. Ivy climbed over the stones, and the windows, covered in a thin layer of dust, looked like clouded eyes that had witnessed countless years pass by. The house seemed almost alive, as though it was watching her, waiting for her to come closer. Something pulled her forward, a gentle nudge from the village itself, and she found herself stepping over the threshold, the wooden door creaking in protest. The air inside was cool, with a faint, lingering scent of earth and age. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked, careful not to disturb the silence that seemed to press down upon her. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she saw faint markings on the walls, symbols etched carefully, almost reverently, into the old plaster. They were intricate, flowing together in a pattern that felt strangely familiar, though she had never seen anything like them before. She couldn't shake the feeling that they held some hidden meaning, a message left behind for someone to find. Tentatively, Lila reached out, tracing her fingers along the symbols. They felt cold, almost unnaturally so, as if the wall itself had been touched by winter's chill. She let her fingers linger, sensing an odd tingling sensation, a faint pulse as if the wall were alive. The room seemed to darken, and she felt the air shift, growing colder and heavier. A sudden, intense cold swept over her, surrounding her like an icy veil. She shivered, drawing her coat tighter around her shoulders, yet the cold seemed to seep through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. It felt as though the temperature had dropped, the warmth of the village replaced by an otherworldly chill. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimmer, a flash of movement. Her gaze shifted to a broken mirror propped against the far wall, its surface cracked and tarnished, glass cloudy and fragmented. For a moment she hesitated, feeling a prickling sensation along the back of her neck. Her own reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed, her breath visible in the chilly air. But as she looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. There, within the fractured glass, was another face, a figure standing just behind her, blurred yet unmistakably familiar. The figure looked like her, only older, her features worn and weary, as though she had lived through years of hardship. Lila felt a chill crawl up her spine as she met the figure's gaze. The eyes staring back at her held a mixture of sorrow and warning, as if urging her to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. Her heart pounded in her chest and she took an instinctive step back, feeling a strange pull towards the figure, as though it were a part of her, some hidden piece of herself reflected in the mirror. She blinked, and the figure vanished, leaving only her own reflection staring back at her. The coldness remained, lingering like a shadow, a reminder of the presence she had just seen. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and she placed a hand on her chest, trying to steady herself. For a moment she questioned what she had seen. The figure had looked so real, yet it had only appeared in the mirror, an echo of herself yet impossibly different. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind, but the memory lingered, vivid and unsettling. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to the wall, her fingers once again tracing the symbols. She felt a strange familiarity in them now, as if they were calling to her, drawing her deeper into their mystery. The air felt charged, thick with the weight of secrets, and she couldn't shake the feeling that these symbols were connected to the figure she had seen, a piece of her past, or perhaps a glimpse of her future. She closed her eyes, focusing on the sensations around her. The silence was absolute, and yet she sensed a whisper, a faint echo of words she couldn't quite make out. It felt like a warning, a quiet voice urging her to understand, to piece together the fragments of a story that had been waiting for her all along. The temperature began to rise slightly, and the room felt less hostile, as though whatever presence had been there was now watching from a distance, allowing her to explore without interference. She couldn't shake the feeling of familiarity, as if she were walking through a memory that didn't belong to her, yet felt so deeply intertwined with her own. Her mind drifted back to the stories her grandmother had told her, tales of ancestors who had faced hardship and endured against all odds. Grandmother had always hinted at mysteries, at things that couldn't be explained, yet she had never spoken of the strange symbols, chilling figure Lila had just seen. Perhaps the village held memories not just of her ancestors, but of herself as well, as though it held fragments of her soul waiting to be uncovered. She felt a strange comfort in that thought, an acceptance of the mystery even as it unsettled her. Lila stepped back, her eyes lingering on the symbols, a silent promise to herself to return, to find out more. The village was calling to her, and she knew she couldn't ignore its whispers. There was a story here, connecting her to a past she had never known, but always felt. As she left the house, the air outside felt warmer, the shadows softer. She glanced back, half expecting to see the figure watching her. There was only the silence of the empty house, its secrets hidden once again. Looking away, she felt a calm settle over her, a quiet resolve to continue her journey, no matter what mysteries lay ahead. The village had opened a door, and though she didn't yet understand its significance, she was ready to explore, to let the shadows guide her towards the answers she sought. As the night deepened, the village seemed to breathe, as if alive, its whispers following her, gentle and insistent, promising that her journey had only just begun. Lila moved carefully through the abandoned house, her footsteps light against the creaky wooden floorboards. The strange symbols on the walls still lingered in her mind, filling her with questions that pulled her deeper into the mystery of her ancestry. The air had begun to feel warmer, less charged, as if whatever energy had been watching her had softened, allowing her to explore freely. In a quiet corner of the room, something caught her eye. One of the floorboards was slightly raised, a small gap that seemed almost deliberate, as though left for someone to find. Curiosity pricked at her, and she knelt down, gently prying it loose. Underneath lay a small, dust-covered journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. Her heart fluttered as she carefully lifted the journal from its hiding place. It was small and frayed around the edges, but as she opened the cover, she felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity. The first page bore her grandmother's handwriting, delicate and precise, each letter penned with a loving hand. Lila's chest tightened as she read the words, memories flooding back of evenings spent by her grandmother's side, listening to stories of the village. Her fingers traced the handwriting, and she felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of comfort that eased the tension that had been building since she arrived. It was as if her grandmother were right there beside her, a silent companion in this eerie place. She read the first few lines, her heart filling with peace. "My dear Lila," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you found your way here, back to the place that holds so much of our history. I hope this journal brings you comfort, as it brought me comfort in times of need. Remember, our family has always been strong, even in the face of the unknown." Lila smiled, feeling her grandmother's presence in the room, a soft whisper of love that wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She turned the page, eager to read more, her heart soothed by the familiar words. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo through the words, reminding her of her strength, her resilience. As she read further, the entries described small memories, tender moments her grandmother had cherished, afternoons spent by the village well, watching the sun filter through the trees, evenings when the village was quiet, holding its secrets close. The journal painted a picture of a place that was alive, filled with whispers and shadows, yet full of beauty and peace. But as she turned another page, her heart skipped. The ink began to fade, the words blurring as if something was erasing them before her very eyes. She blinked, leaning closer, watching as the comforting words vanished, leaving empty, pale lines on the page. A chill ran down her spine as new words appeared, scrawled in a hurried, jagged script that looked nothing like her grandmother's gentle handwriting. "Leave before it's too late." The words seemed to pulse on the page, their presence chilling and ominous. Lila's heart pounded as she stared at them, unable to look away. She tried to turn the page, but her fingers trembled, and the words shifted, twisting into new warnings that filled her with dread. "This village is not what it seems. The shadows are watching, waiting. Leave, Lila, before you become one of them." The warmth she had felt moments before was gone, replaced by a cold that seeped into her bones. She could almost hear a whisper in the air, an echo of her grandmother's voice, but it sounded strained, filled with urgency. A sense of foreboding washed over her, the peaceful memories shattered by the chilling warnings on the page. She tried to reassure herself, telling herself that this was just a trick of her imagination, that the words couldn't possibly change on their own. Yet there they were, stark and undeniable, a message from something beyond the world she knew. Lila looked around the room, half expecting to see shadows creeping closer, but everything remained still. The house was quiet, yet the silence now felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls were listening, waiting for her reaction. She turned back to the journal, flipping through the pages, hoping to find more comforting words, a clue that would explain the warnings, but the pages were blank, save for a few scattered phrases that flickered in and out of sight. "Curse," one word read, then disappeared, replaced by "trap." Her fingers traced the words, a deep sense of unease settling in her chest. She remembered her grandmother's stories, the way she had spoken of the village with both affection and a hint of something darker, something unspoken. Her grandmother had left this place for a reason, yet she had never shared why. It was as if she had been trying to protect Lila from a truth too heavy to bear. The village seemed to shift as she stepped outside, the shadows stretching across the ground as if reaching out to her. The air was thick with the scent of earth and something else, something old and mysterious, She felt a presence in the silence, an awareness that lingered just beyond her vision. Lila took one last look at the journal, her fingers brushing over the leather cover. The warnings echoed in her mind, but there was also a sense of purpose, a feeling that her journey had only just begun. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her thoughts, urging her to be brave, to trust her instincts. The village had secrets, secrets that were woven into the stones and trees, into the very air she breathed. And though fear tugged at her heart, she knew she couldn't leave, not until she had uncovered the truth. With the journal in hand, she walked back down the path, feeling the weight of the village's gaze upon her. The shadows seemed to close in, watching, waiting, but she kept moving forward, her steps steady, her heart resolved. The night was deepening and the village was silent, yet alive with secrets that whispered through the darkness. And as Lila walked, she knew that she was not alone, that something was guiding her, pulling her closer to the truth. The false calm had shattered, but in its place was a quiet strength, a resolve that pushed her forward, even as the shadows followed close behind. Lila's fingers trembled as she flipped through the journal's worn pages, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. Each word felt heavier, sinking deep into her bones, as though the pages themselves held the weight of her family's past. She took a shaky breath, feeling the presence of her grandmother close, yet an unsettling realization settled over her. She was no longer alone in this journey. The journal's entries grew darker as she read on, the comforting memories replaced by descriptions of an ancient ritual, one meant to keep restless spirits at bay. The words were written in her grandmother's delicate hand, but the tone was different, filled with fear and urgency. Lila felt a chill as she read about the ritual, the details hauntingly vivid, as if her grandmother had written them as a warning. "Our family holds the duty," one entry read, "to protect the village from those who cannot rest. They are bound here in the shadows, waiting for the ritual to set them free, or trap them forever." The lines blurred before her eyes, a strange dizziness overtaking her as she read. Her heart raced, each beat echoing louder in the silence. She tried to steady herself, telling herself it was just a story, an old tradition that had no power now. But as she took a deep breath, she heard something, a faint whisper drifting through the room like a distant memory. The sound was so soft she almost thought she had imagined it. But then it grew louder, joined by others, a chorus of quiet, insistent voices murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. Her breath caught as she listened, the whispers weaving through the air like a ghostly lullaby. The voices seemed to call her name, a gentle murmur at first, then more urgent, as though they were growing impatient. She clutched the journal tighter, her fingers digging into the worn leather cover, as the whispers became footsteps, soft yet deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. A shiver ran down her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She could feel them, a presence hovering just beyond her vision, hidden in the shadows, yet so close she could almost feel their breath. The room felt colder, the air thickening with an unnatural stillness. It was as if the house itself held its breath, watching her, waiting for her next move. Desperation clawed at her, and she glanced back at the journal, her eyes scanning the pages in search of answers. The entries described the ritual in detail, a series of chants, offerings, and symbols that bound the spirits to the village, trapping them so they would not haunt the living. But something had gone wrong. She could feel it in the words, in the hurried handwriting and the smudged ink. Her family had tried to contain the spirits, yet somehow they had failed. Lila's thoughts raced as she connected the pieces. Her grandmother must have known the truth, the reason why the family had left this place behind. They had carried the knowledge, the responsibility, but had chosen to flee, leaving the spirits restless and the ritual incomplete. Her hands shook as she read on, and the whispers grew louder, sharper, their tone shifting from soft pleas to something more demanding. She covered her ears, but the voices seemed to seep through, filling her mind with fragments of words, memories, and emotions that weren't her own. Suddenly her vision blurred and she was no longer in the abandoned house. Instead she saw flashes of a ritual, ancient and eerie, performed under the cover of night. Figures dressed in dark robes stood in a circle, their faces hidden, chanting words she couldn't understand. The air was thick with incense, and an altar stood at the center, covered in strange symbols that pulsed with a dark energy. The scene shifted, and she was back in the village, but it felt different, older, untouched by time. Shadows moved among the houses, figures drifting silently, their forms blurred and translucent. They were watching her, their eyes filled with sorrow and longing, as if trapped in a place they couldn't escape. The vision faded, and she found herself back in the house, her heart pounding. The whispers had grown louder, closer, filling the room with a desperate urgency. She could hear footsteps now, soft but relentless, circling her, as though the spirits were gathering, drawn to her presence. "Why did you come back?" a voice whispered, low and filled with sorrow. She froze, her breath caught in her throat as the voice continued, echoing through the room. "Leave while you still can," another voice murmured, softer yet filled with warning. It sounded like her grandmother, but distorted, as though coming from a place far beyond the world she knew. Lila squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the urge to run. She had come here for answers, yet now every instinct screamed at her to leave, to turn her back on the shadows that surrounded her. But something inside her pushed back, a quiet resolve that steadied her even as fear clawed at her heart. The whispers shifted, turning to pleading, voices begging her to stay, to help them find peace. She felt their sorrow, their longing, as if their pain had seeped into her very bones. The connection was undeniable. These spirits were part of her family, bound to her by blood and memory. She couldn't abandon them, not when they had waited so long for someone to set them free. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the journal. The final pages held a faded drawing of the ritual circle, the symbols etched carefully, as though her grandmother had hoped that one day someone would understand. The symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own, calling to her, urging her to complete what her family had started. Taking a deep breath, Lila whispered, "I won't leave you." Her voice was steady, though her hands shook. The whispers softened, a gentle murmur that felt almost like gratitude. The footsteps receded, and the air grew warmer, as though the spirits had accepted her promise. She knew what she had to do. The ritual would require courage, an acceptance of the unknown. But she felt her grandmother's presence beside her, a quiet strength that filled her with a sense of purpose. The village held its secrets, its shadows, but she would face them, one step at a time. The night was deep, and the journey ahead uncertain, yet Lila felt a calm settle over her, a quiet understanding that she was not alone. The whispers faded into silence, and for the first time she felt a sense of peace in the stillness. The shadows watched, patient and waiting, but she felt no fear now. Only a quiet resolve, a promise to honor the spirits of her family and bring them the peace they had long sought. With the journal clutched tightly in her hands, Lila felt a sudden urge to leave. The comforting presence she'd felt from the journal had faded, replaced by a creeping dread that curled around her heart, growing with each passing second. She was aware of the shadows, of the village watching her, silent yet expectant. Her promise to the spirits lingered in her mind, but her instincts were now telling her to get away, to find a way out of this place before it was too late. Steeling herself, she turned toward the narrow, winding path that led out of the village. The air felt dense, as if the mist and shadows were conspiring to hold her back. She could hear the soft rustling of leaves, the quiet sighs of the trees, as though the village itself were breathing, reluctant to let her go. The path stretched before her, dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon. Her footsteps echoed soft and steady, and she focused on the sound, letting it soothe her frayed nerves. "Just keep going," she whispered to herself, the words a fragile anchor in the growing sea of unease. But as she walked, the path began to shift. Shadows deepened, lengthening in the moonlight, their edges blurring as they swayed across the ground. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the sense of dread crept up her spine. The trees seemed to close in around her, the branches twisting overhead like grasping hands. After a few minutes, a familiar shape appeared in the distance, the silhouette of the house she had just left. Lila stopped, her heart skipping a beat as she stared at it, confusion flooding her mind. She was certain she had taken the path away from the village, yet here she was, standing before the same eerie house, its windows dark and silent, watching her with that same unsettling stillness. A chill spread through her as she turned around, retracing her steps, trying a different path. She walked faster this time, her steps quickening as she distanced herself from the house. But as the trees thinned and the mist lifted, her stomach dropped. Once again she found herself back at the same spot, staring at the familiar, looming figure of the house, its shadow stretching across the ground like a silent guardian. Panic began to bubble up, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the impossible. She took another path, then another, moving in circles, her steps more frantic with each attempt, but each path led her back, looping around like a trap, binding her to this one spot, this one cursed place. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the house, the weight of realization pressing down on her. She was trapped. No matter where she turned, the village seemed to conspire to keep her here, pulling her back to the house like an invisible thread, binding her to its secrets. The journal felt heavy in her hands, the words now like a warning she could no longer ignore. She opened it, flipping through the pages, searching for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. Her eyes scanned the faded entries, and one line stood out, scrawled hastily in the margin. "Those who stay too long become one with the village." A shiver ran through her as the meaning sank in. The spirits she had promised to help, they were trapped here, bound to this place, and now it seemed she was too. Her mind raced, replaying her grandmother's warnings, the entries she had read about the ritual, the incomplete binding that had left the spirits restless. Lila's hands shook as she held the journal, the helplessness settling over her like a weight she couldn't shake. She could feel the eyes of the village upon her, the silent judgment of the shadows, as though they were waiting, watching her struggle. The path she had taken, the strange loops that brought her back to the house. Each step felt like a pull, an invisible force drawing her The last remnants of hope faded as she looked around, the trees and shadows closing in, their silent judgment heavy in the air. She was alone, trapped in a place that held only memories and whispers, a prison of shadows that would never let her go. As the night deepened, she felt the village settle around her, its presence sinking into her bones, binding her to its secrets. She had come here seeking answers, but now the only answer was silence, a silence that echoed with the weight of generations, a silence that promised she would never leave. And as she stood there staring at the empty windows of the house, she felt a strange, quiet acceptance settle over her. The village had claimed her, as it had claimed her family, and now she was one of them, bound to the shadows, a part of the endless loop that would carry on long after she was gone. Lila stood in the silence, the weight of despair pressing down on her. She felt trapped, held captive by the village's relentless loop, its paths folding back on themselves in a pattern she couldn't escape. She had tried every way she could think of, each path leading her to the same spot, each turn pulling her deeper into the village's grasp. The shadows grew thicker, the night's chill settling over her, wrapping her in a cold embrace. Just as she felt the last bit of hope slipping away, she sensed something shift in the darkness. A faint rustling, soft footsteps padding through the leaves, broke the silence. She turned, her heart pounding, as a figure stepped into view. A young boy, no older than 10, standing just a few feet away. The boy looked familiar, yet she was certain she had never seen him before. His dark eyes held a quiet knowledge, an awareness that felt far beyond his years. He was dressed simply, in clothes that seemed out of place and time, and his gaze met hers with an intensity that made her shiver. "Who are you?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt as if she were speaking to a ghost, a fragment of the past come to life. The boy tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You're the one who came back," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange calm that felt both reassuring and unsettling. "You're here to finish what you started." Lila's breath caught, her mind racing. "What do you mean? I don't understand." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You came back to help them," he murmured. "But you can't leave until it's done. The village won't let you go." A shiver ran down her spine as his words sank in. She had come here to find answers, to uncover the truth about her family, but she hadn't expected to be drawn so deeply into the village's curse. "But how do I help them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The boy looked at her, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in his gaze. "There's a way out," he said, his voice soft and steady, "but only if you help me." Lila's heart pounded as she took in his words. "Help you? With what?" His eyes darkened and he took a step closer, his small hand reaching out to her. "The ritual," he said simply, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for her to find it. "It wasn't finished. That's why they're trapped here, why they can't find peace." Lila glanced down at his hand, her mind spinning. The ritual. Her grandmother's journal had described it in fragments, a ritual meant to bind the restless spirits, to keep them from haunting the village. But the details had been faded, incomplete, and now she understood why. Her family hadn't completed it. They had left, abandoning the spirits to wander in the shadows, bound to the village and unable to rest. The boy watched her, his expression unreadable. "You have to finish it," he said softly. "Only then can they be free. Only then can you leave." Lila hesitated, her mind torn between the fear that gripped her and the glimmer of hope he was offering. This boy seemed to hold the key to everything, the answers she had been searching for, the path that would lead her out of the village. But the thought of performing the ritual, of delving into something so ancient and unknown, filled her with a quiet dread. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. What do I have to do? The boy's face softened, and for a moment he looked almost relieved. Follow me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Without waiting for her response, he turned and began walking, his footsteps light and quick, as though he had walked this path 1,000 times. Lila followed, her heart pounding with each step. The village seemed to shift around them, the shadows parting to reveal a path she hadn't seen before, a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees closed in, their branches intertwining overhead, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and a quiet stillness settled over them, as if the forest itself were watching, waiting. The boy stopped at a small clearing, his eyes scanning the ground. Lila's gaze followed his, and she saw a faint circle of stones arranged in the center of the clearing, each stone marked with a symbol she recognized from her grandmother's journal. The symbols seemed to pulse in the moonlight, glowing with a faint otherworldly energy. "This is where it must be done," the boy said, his voice soft yet filled with a quiet urgency. "The spirits are waiting. They've been waiting for so long." Lila felt a chill as she looked at the circle, her mind racing with questions. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do you know all this?" The boy met her gaze, his dark eyes reflecting a sorrow she couldn't quite understand. "I've been here before," he said simply. "I know what they need. I know what you need." A sense of unease settled over her, but she pushed it aside, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice steady. The boy took her hand, guiding her to the edge of the circle. "Stand here," he instructed, his tone calm and assured. "Close your eyes and listen. You'll hear them, the ones who are trapped. They'll tell you what to say, what to do." Lila swallowed, her heart pounding as she stepped into the circle. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the forest wash over her. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, and for a moment she felt nothing but the cold air pressing down on her. Then slowly, she began to hear them, the whispers, soft and sorrowful, rising from the shadows. The voices were distant at first, fragmented and faint, but they grew louder, clearer, weaving together in a haunting melody that echoed through the clearing. "Free us, help us, release us." The voices filled her mind, their sorrow and desperation seeping into her, wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. She could feel their pain, their longing, and a deep sense of responsibility settled over her. They had been waiting for this, for someone to finish what her family had started. The boy's voice broke through the whispers, calm and steady. "Repeat after me," he said softly, his words carrying a weight that felt both familiar and ancient. He began to chant, his voice low and melodic, speaking in a language she didn't understand yet somehow knew. Lila repeated the words, her voice trembling as she spoke. The symbols on the stones began to glow brighter, casting an eerie light over the clearing. The air felt charged, alive with an energy that made her skin prickle, her heart racing as the ritual unfolded around her. The voices grew louder, a chorus of gratitude and relief, and she felt a warmth spread through her, filling her with a sense of peace she hadn't known since she arrived in the village. The spirits were leaving, their presence fading into the night, their pain finally lifted. As the last word left her lips, she opened her eyes. The clearing was silent, the symbols dimming as the energy faded, leaving only the soft glow of the moonlight. She turned to the boy, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But as she looked at him, she realized he was fading too, his form growing fainter, as though he was slipping away into the shadows. "Will I see you again?" she asked, a pang of sadness in her chest. The boy's face softened, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You already have," he said, his voice drifting on the breeze as his form dissolved into the night. Lila stood alone in the clearing, her heart filled with both relief and an unshakable sense of wonder. The village had released her, the curse broken, the spirit set free, and as she took a step back onto the path, she felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet certainty that she had honored her family, her ancestors, and brought peace to the village at last. With the boy's words lingering in her mind, she left the village, the shadows watching her one last time before fading into the mist, their presence now a part of her past, their whispers finally silent. The village lay silent under a shroud of mist, the stillness broken only by Lila's hesitant footsteps as she followed the boy deeper into its heart. He moved with an eerie calm, his small figure drifting through the shadows, guiding her with a sense of purpose she didn't fully understand. The closer they drew to the center of the village, the colder the air became, thick with a dampness that seemed to seep into her bones. The boy paused before a hidden entrance at the edge of an old stone building, half covered by creeping ivy and shadowed by thick branches overhead. Without a word, he led her through a narrow archway, down a set of worn stone steps that spiraled into the earth. The darkness deepened with each step, the walls closing in as they descended, and a faint, unpleasant smell rose from below, a scent of damp earth and something far more ancient, the decaying remnants of time. Lila's heart raced, her hands brushing against the cold stone walls as they reached the bottom of the steps. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight, and the darkness thickened, only faintly illuminated by the soft glow from the boy's lantern. The air grew colder, sharper, filling her lungs with each shuddering breath, and she felt a sense of foreboding settle over her. They stepped into a large, low-ceilinged chamber, carved from rough stone, its walls etched with ancient carvings that seemed to shift and flicker in the lantern light. Lila could barely make out the shapes, figures with hollow eyes, twisted in agony, surrounded by symbols she couldn't understand. They told a story, a silent, haunting tale that filled her with a sense of dread. The boy walked forward, his eyes fixed on the far wall. He stopped in front of a large stone altar, covered with eerie relics, old tarnished coins, faded pieces of cloth, small bones, and strange metal charms. A faint chill seeped from the altar, curling around her fingers as she reached out to touch one of the relics, an instinctive curiosity that made her shiver. Who were they? She whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. The boy glanced at her, his dark eyes shadowed. "They were the ones who came before you," he replied, his tone distant, almost reverent. "The ancestors who bound themselves to this place. The ones who are trapped." Lila swallowed, her gaze tracing the carvings along the walls. They seemed to tell a fragmented story, a family lineage burdened by a terrible curse, bound to the village by forces they couldn't control. The carvings depicted figures standing in a ritual circle, their faces etched with fear and despair. At the center stood a figure, taller than the rest, arms raised as if performing an incantation, binding the spirits of those around them. A cold sense of recognition washed over her as she stared at the central figure, feeling a strange connection she couldn't explain. Her family had tried to break free of this curse, yet each generation seemed to return, drawn back to this dark place, unable to escape its pull. The boy moved closer to the altar, his hand resting on one of the symbols carved into the stone. They wanted freedom, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. But they could never leave. Each one of them came back. And now you're here. The weight of his words settled over her, a quiet dread creeping into her heart. She felt the cold press of the air, the dampness seeping through her skin, and the smell of decay grew stronger, filling her senses with an overwhelming discomfort. The crypt felt alive, as though it were watching her, the shadows shifting in the corners of her vision, keeping her under their gaze. Why? Why did they do this? She asked, her voice trembling. The boy's gaze drifted over the carvings, his expression unreadable. They thought they could control it, he said softly. They thought the ritual would protect them, bind the spirit so they could rest. But something went wrong. The ritual was incomplete, and the curse was passed down, each generation trapped here, forced to finish what the last had started. A cold sense of dread filled her as she realized the truth. Her family had been bound to this village, not by choice, but by a legacy they couldn't escape. They were tied to the shadows, to the spirits that lingered in the crypt, and now she was part of it, pulled into a story that stretched back through generations. The boy turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting a sorrow that felt far beyond his years. "You're the last one," he said softly. "The last to come back. If you don't finish it, the curse will never end." The carvings seemed to pulse, their twisted forms pressing into her vision, each figure etched with a sorrowful gaze that pierced her heart. She could feel their presence, a weight that surrounded her, filling the chamber with a silent plea. They wanted release, freedom from the curse that had bound them to this dark place. A shiver ran through her as she stepped closer to the altar, her fingers tracing the symbols carved into the stone. Each one felt cold and damp, as though the stone itself held the memories of those who had come before. She could feel their desperation, their helplessness, as if they were calling out to her, urging her to finish what they had begun. The boy's voice broke the silence, a quiet, steady presence that anchored her in the growing unease. "You can free them," he murmured, his tone filled with a strange hope. "But you must perform the ritual. Only then can they rest." Lila's mind raced, torn between the fear that pulsed through her and the strange connection she felt to the crypt, to the shadows that lingered here waiting for release. Her ancestors had tried to break free, yet their efforts had failed, leaving their spirits bound to the village, forever trapped in its shadows. She took a deep breath, feeling the damp, cold air fill her lungs, the smell of decay thick and suffocating. Her hand rested on the altar, the stone cold and unyielding beneath her fingers. She could feel the weight of her family's history pressing down on her, a burden she hadn't asked for yet couldn't ignore. The boy watched her, his gaze unwavering. "Will you help them?" he asked, his voice soft yet filled with an urgency that made her heart ache. Lila closed her eyes, the carvings and shadows swirling around her mind. She could feel the presence of her ancestors, their spirits bound to this place, waiting for the release they had never found. The crypt was a prison, a silent witness to their suffering, and she held the key to their freedom. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice steady yet filled with a quiet determination. "I'll finish the ritual." The boy nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then follow me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He led her to the center of the crypt, where the shadows grew thickest, their presence almost tangible as they gathered around her. Lila stood in the center of the chamber, her heart pounding as she prepared to face the ritual that had haunted her family for generations. The boy's voice guided her, soft and steady, as he chanted words she didn't understand, each phrase filling the air with a tension that made her skin prickle. The shadows shifted, swirling around her like a dark mist, and the relics on the altar began to glow faintly, their eerie light casting strange patterns across the walls. The carvings seemed to come alive, the figures shifting and twisting, their hollow eyes watching her with a silent plea. As the ritual continued, Lila felt the spirit's presence grow stronger, their sorrow and desperation filling the chamber. She could feel their pain, their helplessness, as though their emotions were her own, binding her to their suffering. But amid the fear and darkness, she felt a quiet strength rise within her, a determination to finish what her family had started, to break the curse that had held them captive for so long. She spoke the final words, her voice steady, and a surge of energy filled the chamber, pushing back the shadows, lifting the weight that had bound the crypt. The silence that followed was thick, charged with a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The shadows faded, the carvings stilled, and the air grew warmer, filled with a quiet relief. Lila opened her eyes, her gaze meeting the boy's. He nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. The spirits were free, their pain lifted, their presence fading into the night. And as she took a step back, the crypt seemed to breathe, its secrets finally at rest, leaving only the faint echo of her ancestors' whispers, their story now a part of her own. The crypt was silent, its heavy air thick with expectation. Lila's heart beat rapidly as she prepared to perform the final steps of the ritual, the boy's quiet voice guiding her. The shadows clung to the edges of the chamber, swirling slowly, as though waiting for the moment to close in. Despite the chill, she felt sweat beading on her forehead, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Speak the words," the boy whispered, his voice low and steady. But something about his tone had changed. A coldness lingered beneath the surface, a sharp edge that made her skin prickle with unease. She cast a quick glance at him, but he kept his gaze fixed on the altar, his face partially obscured by shadows. She took a deep breath and began to chant, her voice trembling as she repeated the phrases he had taught her, each word echoing through the crypt like a faint drum beat. But as she spoke, she sensed a shift in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on her, wrapping around her like an unseen weight. The shadows around her thickened, creeping closer, their dark forms twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. The boy's face began to change, his features twisting, morphing into something darker, something that made her stomach churn. His eyes grew colder, empty of the innocence she had seen in him before, replaced by a hollow darkness that seemed to swallow all light. A cruel smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer soft and guiding but harsh, like a jagged whisper slicing through the air. You thought you could save them, he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. You thought you were their salvation, foolish girl. A chill ran down her spine as his words sunk in, a wave of dread flooding her senses. She backed away, her heart pounding, but the shadows closed in, blocking every path, trapping her within the circle. The boy's form continued to shift, his face contorting, his body stretching and twisting, becoming something unnatural, something inhuman. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, the stones cold and unyielding as she pressed her hands against them, desperate for some anchor in this nightmare. The crypt grew colder, the dampness seeping into her bones, and the scent of decay intensified, filling her lungs with each breath. As the boy's form fully transformed, he became a looming, shadowy figure, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. His voice echoed through the chamber, low and mocking, each word a taunt that cut into her mind. Your ancestors weren't saved, he hissed, his voice like the scrape of metal against stone. They're here, waiting, bound to this place by their own failings, just like you will be. Lila's body shook as she looked around, her gaze darting to the shadows that now pulsed with life, their forms shifting, taking on vaguely human shapes. Faces emerged from the darkness, her ancestors, their hollow eyes filled with rage and sorrow, their twisted mouths contorted in silent screams. She could feel their anger, their betrayal, as though they blamed her for their eternal imprisonment. The boy, or the creature he had become, leaned closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his icy breath on her skin, hear the low, insidious whispers that filled her mind, seeping into her thoughts, unraveling her sense of control. "Do you feel it?" he murmured, his voice soft yet sharp like a blade pressed against her throat. "The fear, the helplessness. This is your fate, Lila. You came back, just like they did, bound by blood and by the sins of your family." The shadows grew darker, pressing in from all sides, their weight suffocating, closing off the air, the light, any sense of escape. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her as she tried to scream, but no sound came. She was trapped, bound by an invisible force that seemed to tighten with each passing second, pulling her deeper into the darkness. In desperation she struggled, clawing at the ground, her hands scraping against the rough stone, her mind filled with a primal urge to escape. But the shadows moved with her, matching her every movement, trapping her in a loop of fear and despair. The faces of her ancestors leered at her, their eyes empty yet accusatory, their mouths twisted into grimaces of hatred. "You're one of us now," the shadowed creature sneered, his voice filling the chamber. "Bound to the village, bound to the curse. You'll never leave." Lila's mind spiraled, her thoughts a whirl of terror as she realized the truth. She was part of the curse now, just like her ancestors, a soul trapped in the shadows, forever bound to the village and its darkness. The creature's words echoed in her mind, repeating in a ceaseless loop that drowned out her thoughts, her hope, her sense of self. In a last, desperate surge, she tried to push him away, to break free from the shadows that held her captive. She could feel her strength slipping, her energy fading as the darkness closed in, consuming her, drawing her into the depths of the crypt. But just as she felt herself succumbing, a faint warmth flickered within her, a memory of her grandmother's voice, soft and comforting, reminding her of the strength that had been passed down through generations. "Remember, Lila," the voice whispered, a quiet thread of hope woven through the terror. "You come from a line of those who endure." With a surge of defiance, she drew on that memory, clutching it like a lifeline as she fought against the shadows. Her fingers found the stone she had once touched on the altar, the symbol faintly pulsing beneath her grip. She whispered the words her grandmother had taught her, a chant of protection, of resilience, her voice trembling but steady. The shadows recoiled, hissing as the words filled the chamber, the light from the symbol pushing them back. The creature screamed, its form writhing, contorting as it tried to cling to her. But she kept chanting, her voice growing stronger, louder, filling the crypt with a power that was both ancient and new. The darkness began to break, the shadows melting away, the faces of her ancestors fading into the mist. The crypt grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as the creature's form dissolved, his eyes filled with rage as he vanished into the void. When the last shadow faded, the crypt fell silent. Lila slumped to the ground, her heart pounding, her breath ragged as she felt the warmth of freedom settle over her. The weight of the curse lifted, the dark presence broken, leaving only the faint whisper of her grandmother's voice, a reminder of the strength that had carried her through. Slowly, Lila rose, her gaze sweeping over the empty crypt. The relics lay still, their purpose fulfilled, their power faded. She took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the damp air fill her lungs, no longer oppressive but freeing. The curse had been broken, the spirits released, and at last she was free. With one final look at the altar, she turned and climbed the steps, the light of dawn breaking through the mist as she emerged from the crypt. The village now silent, its shadows gone. The journey had left its mark, but she knew that she had broken the cycle, ended the curse that had haunted her family for generations. As she walked away, she felt the presence of her ancestors, no longer vengeful but at peace, their whispers soft like a lullaby as they finally found rest. And with a heart full of quiet strength, Lila left the village, the shadows behind her, free at last. The darkness around Lila seemed endless, pulling her deeper with every heartbeat. She felt herself fading, slipping into the shadows that twisted and closed in like suffocating smoke. Her strength was almost gone, the last threads of hope slipping from her grasp as the crypt seemed ready to swallow her whole. Then, with a final desperate burst of energy, she spoke the last words of the ritual, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with the force of generations. The ancient chant echoed through the crypt, resonating against the walls, growing louder as if amplified by the spirits themselves. A sudden rush of warmth flooded through her, a powerful surge that pushed back the darkness, dispelling the shadows and banishing the twisted faces of her ancestors into the void. Silence fell, a profound, all-encompassing stillness as the shadows faded into nothing. Lila collapsed to the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight that had clung to her now lifting, the air around her warm and strangely peaceful. She felt a sense of calm settle over her, an overwhelming relief that left her on the verge of tears. The body grew lighter, the thoughts clearer, and as she closed her eyes she felt herself drift away, the surroundings melting into a gentle, comforting darkness. But as she got out of bed, a strange feeling tugged at the edge of her mind. A chill crept over her, a whisper of something left unfinished, as though a piece of the night had followed her back. She shook her head, brushing it off as lingering nerves, and walked over to her dresser, glancing at her reflection in the mirror. She looked tired, her face pale, shadows under her eyes, but the familiar sight was reassuring. She let out a breath, leaning in to get a better look, to convince herself that she was safe, that she was home. But then, just as she reached to touch her reflection, she noticed a faint movement behind her in the mirror's glass. Her heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat as she watched, frozen, as the shadowy form of a young boy appeared, standing silently just behind her shoulder. His face was partially obscured, but his eyes were unmistakable, dark, watchful, filled with an ancient sorrow and an unspoken promise. The boy's gaze met hers in the mirror, his eyes filled with a chilling calm that made her blood run cold. His lips parted, and though no sound escaped, she felt his words echo through her mind, a silent message that resonated deep within her. "It's not over," the voice whispered, soft and cold, lingering like a breath of wind through the trees. "The curse runs deeper than you know." Lila's heart pounded as she stared at his reflection, her body frozen in place, unable to look away. The calm of her room dissolved, replaced by a gnawing dread that twisted in her stomach. The boy's figure began to fade, his form dissolving into the morning light, until only her own reflection remained. But the eerie calm in his words, the haunting message, lingered, sinking into her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She was back in her world, in her home, yet the boundary between the two felt thinner, more fragile, as though at any moment she could slip back into the darkness of the village, back to the curse that clung to her family. With a trembling breath, Lila turned away from the mirror, but the boy's words echoed in her mind, a quiet, insistent reminder that the past was not as distant as it seemed. The village, the crypt, the shadows of her ancestors, they were all part of her now, a secret she could never escape. And as she stood there, the light of morning spilling across her room,